Oh, hello there. Hi. Hi. Is this GB1 Lab? Oh, wow. Oh, I think we'll be talking about plants today. Oh, you'll be talking about plants for the rest of this semester. So you better get used to it. Plants are very cool. Yep. This hat is made out of plants, made out of palm leaves from Mexico. Anyways, yes, plants we'll be talking about for the rest of the semester, and hopefully you'll get to start liking them. For one, GB students really do not like plants for some reason, and they have a hateful vendetta against them. They really like animals more, which I argue is kind of discriminatory. Uh, so try to just keep an open mind, okay? Like plants, plants are very interesting if you look at the right ones, and if you try to understand them based on their cycles. All right. So we'll be talking about plants for the rest of the semester. So get used to it and really learn how they work. All right, so where do plants come from? Where do they come from? Well, let's look at their evolutionary lineage. Here we have a tree of life of just plants. So we look at the base here. Let's get a nice little pointer. Right here. And so we look at the base here. These are the most primitive forms of plants. These are the ancestors of plants. And there's photosynthetic, obviously. You remember protist? Protist, the algae, protist algae that are photosynthetic, they swallowed a cyanobacteria and maybe they can photosynthesize now. They kind of branched off, became multicellular. Their cells turned into more cells that are connected to each other. They turned into plants. And they eventually transitioned to land, which is very cool. And we'll go up this tree of life for the rest of the semester, and we'll talk about each little phase. Uh, you'll read about these guys over here, the charophytes. These are the ancestors to all of the plants that you see up here. So we're going to talk about bryophytes today, which are mosses, and we'll talk about ferns today, which are vascular plants, and they're really big. Mosses are pretty small, and they're kind of hidden in little locations that they hide from the sun, and they're in moist areas. So when a lot of rain comes, you'll see mosses nice and sprouting out and being happy. But ferns, they're more resistant. They can live in the sunlight. They really like it, actually. And they have an interesting life cycle. And I'm going to teach you how to find them so that you can go outside and you can look at plants and you can know what it is. Because if there's anything you get from this class, it's that you actually understand what life is like and how to identify it and just kind of understand how things work. So we'll go into that detail. This is a better diagram of this is like this, but picture based. So let's look at the kind of the progression of life. So here we have algae. These are the protists that you learned about. You may have PTSD from the practical, but these are the algae. Photosynthetic, of course, and they're living in a pond. You know, they're just doing photosynthesis, splitting in half, going about their day. Some of them, throughout the history of life, some of them started becoming multicellular. They stick together, and they keep on sticking together, and with multicellularity, you going from a single cell to a multicellular organism, with multicellularity comes the ability to differentiate the tissues. So when you have multiple cells, you can split the task between each cell to do different things. In the case of plants, cells were split to become roots, and other ones became shoots that could become photosynthetic and use sunlight. The roots go into the ground, they absorb nutrients. So that's just an example of differentiation and multicellular things. That's just what being a multicellular organism is all about. We're multicellular. We have all kinds of different things going on. Each of our cells are specialized. And just like plants and us, plants are also specialized cells, each with their own little job. And you'll see this progression as we look at each little plant along the tree of life. And at the end of the semester, we'll talk about flowers and flowering plants and fruits, which are pretty neat. And those are very complex. So we'll go all over that. And you'll have to know all of that, of course. So yeah, let's look at this progression a little bit more. So we go from unicellular to a little bit of multicellularity. You'll read about that, the bryophytes. These are living in a pond. They're multicellular. They're pretty simple, but they're pretty successful too. And here's the interesting part, is the transition to land. Transitioning to land is difficult, and plants did it very well. As soon as they transitioned to land, they conquered the earth. They literally conquered the earth. They sprouted everywhere across all of the continents. It wasn't that hard because all the continents were together at that time, if you look at the maps, but they colonized the earth. And how do you do that? What are the challenges you have to overcome? You have the sun. The sun is dangerous. It will shoot out rays of UV radiation, hit the little cells, the little poor cells, and it will mutate all their DNA, their chromosomes, and they'll die. And that was a big challenge that he had to overcome, but they only did it incrementally. So they slowly transitioned from the pond to land. And they developed little mutations, little adaptations to kind of survive on land. To how do you fight against drought, desiccation, when you dry out? Because if we go to land, you're not living in the water anymore. You're going to dry out. So you have to develop adaptations to kind of defend against that, to keep water inside your system so you don't die. And defending yourself against the sun, that's a big deal as well. And plants do really well. In fact, they love the sun. So how do they do that? So just keep that in mind. That transition to land was a really big deal. And actually, fungi kind of helps, which we talked about last time with fungi. So there we go. There is the transition to land. That's kind of the evolution of plants. So here we have some mosses, then ferns. So these are mosses, these are ferns. And remember, like, if you look at dinosaur movies or whatnot, you'll see ferns a lot. Ferns used to be gigantic and they colonized the earth. And that was before these guys came, these big trees and these big flowering plants. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. But these guys took over the whole world. But back then with dinosaurs and stuff, ferns were a big deal. But no, not so much anymore. So I'm going to try to convince you that plants are not boring. It's a hard task for sure. It's a hard thing for me to do. It makes my life as a TA very difficult. Like I can't teach about animals. So plants can move. They can. They're not just dormant. In fact, they can make sperm and eggs, and sperms can swim. Pollen is sperm. So, you know, like an oak tree will shed pollen all over your car. That's sperm. And actually, pollen are these little particles that fly around, and they actually make a tube, like a little weird branching tube. We'll talk about that later in the semester. They eat each other. They're parasitic. They parasitize each other, and they can be poisonous. They can kill things, really. Lots of things in the world, medical industry, treatment for cancer. A lot of things come from plants. A lot of chemicals come from plants too. So, you know, cinnamon, vanilla, all these things. Plants are really good at making chemicals. And we love that. Gardening is really nice. We eat plants. They're symbiotic. Plants can be symbiotic with each other. They can live on each other and inside each other. They're extremely complex. They're not simple. Plants are not simple as much as you like to think. They're really complex things. Their life cycle, which we'll talk about in a second, their life cycle alternates. And it's very complex. Now, this is the very cool part. This is super cool, all right? Plants do not die if you mutate, usually. So if you mutate, if your genes mutate, you're very sensitive. Animals are very sensitive to mutations, and they're very sensitive to damage. So animals are not as resilient as plants are. Plants are super resistant. They're resilient. You cut off their limbs, they'll just grow another one. They don't care. If they mutate, uh, they produce more strawberries than they're supposed to. That doesn't matter. Who cares? But if you mutate, you produce another kidney or another heart, you'll probably die. So just keep that in mind, that difference, the body plan difference. Animals are very specific in how they produce their things. We always have two arms in the right place. We always have a heart. We always have a brain in the right place, all perfectly structured, very neatly designed. And plants, they're not so much. They just kind of do whatever they want, depending on the moment. That's why trees look random. That's why just every plant, go outside, look at plants. They're kind of randomly organized. They don't have very specific, neat designs. So if you cut off the tree limb, they're not going to die. They're just going to grow another one. And there you go. They can mutate as well. And plants are known for mutating. They'll duplicate their genome. They don't care. You can have really gigantic strawberries. You can make huge fruits and do whatever you want. We can genetically modify them easily. And you'll find that in the grocery store. Plants just don't care. In fact, they love mutations. That's how they're so successful. That's why there's so many. So there you go. They rapidly colonize land. And we talked about that a little bit earlier. Like animals, they came from a unicellular ancestor. Every multicellular organism has a unicellular ancestor. That's just how life works. They get diseases. They do. Plant diseases are a big deal in the agricultural industry. They symbiose with fungi and bacteria. Like we have bacteria in our guts, they have bacteria in their leaves and their roots and all of their structures. And it's very complex interactions. So just keep that in mind. Just try to understand that, keep an open mind that plants are pretty interesting. People develop interest all the time. Why do people get interested in plants? Because they look more into it. They keep an open mind and they try to understand why. And they say, oh, wow, that's really cool. Why is this poisonous? Why would this kill me if I ate it? The exact structure of the chemicals that the plant produces. If I eat it and it kills me, how does that work? Just keep an open mind. People develop interest in all kinds of things, and you kind of want to understand why do they develop these interests? How can you get interested in everything? So here we'll start mosses. So we'll start here with this arrow and the mosses. So we'll talk about bryophytes. Bryophyte. Phyte is the ending of any plant phylum. So phyte means plant. So you'll have bryophytes, tracheophytes, gymnosperms, angiosperms. That's a little bit different. We'll talk about that. Phytes. That's just a means plant. So bryophyte are the mosses. You know that. And before I tell you about their life cycle, I have to tell you a little bit about what DNA is. I'm sure you know a little bit about it already, but we're just going to start from ground zero. So what is a chromosome? A chromosome is just a linear strand of DNA. That's all it is. It's a strand of DNA, and each little section of the DNA molecule are called genes. So this little section here is a gene that codes for a protein, and a protein runs everything inside of the cell. Inside of all cells, proteins are required for structure and for moving and for doing things, catalyzing reactions, all the kinds of things. That's just what life is all about. You have DNA. Specific portions of the DNA are called genes, which code for a protein. And these are just different proteins, but insulin is a protein. Antibodies that we make against the coronavirus are proteins. Hemoglobin, all kinds of things are proteins. Proteins run the show. Proteins are everything to life, at least right now. So we'll talk about chromosomes right now. Chromosomes are just the linear strands of DNA, as I said earlier. You can have multiple copies of that chromosome, meaning that you can have multiple copies of a gene. So you have 2 copies of your insulin gene. The gene makes insulin. You have 2 copies of it. You're diploid. You have 48 total chromosomes and 24 chromosomes total, but you have 2 copies of those. So you have 2 insulin genes, and that's a big deal. You want 2 insulin genes. That's really good, because if you mutate one, you'll die if you only had 1 chromosome, and you won't make insulin. You will be diabetic. You probably won't die. You'll be diabetic at least. So what is haploid and what is diploid? This is essential to understanding plants and their life cycle, so pay attention, okay? Pay attention. I know it's kind of boring, but pay attention. Okay, diploid and haploid. It is essential to know. And it's involved with sexual reproduction. Diploid and haploid. Haploid means one copy of your chromosome, which means you have 1 copy of each little gene that makes a protein that runs everything inside of the whole organism. So 1 gene, say if you were haploid, you'd have 1 insulin gene, which would be bad, okay? That's why most organisms are diploid, and you have 2 copies. Plants alternate between haploid and diploid, called a haplodiplontic life cycle. So that's what this is. A haploid plant is this. A haploid plant, 1N, N is just the number of chromosomes. 2N is that you have another copy. You have 2 copies of that chromosome. I know it's kind of difficult to understand at first, but just pay attention and stay with me, okay? So diploid, you have 2 copies of each gene, which is really useful. The haplodiplontic life cycle of a plant, the gametophyte, is haploid, okay? Everything, a gametophyte is a structure of a plant. It makes gametes, and gametes are eggs and sperm. Egg and a sperm cell combine to make a zygote that is diploid. So 2 haploid cells come together and they make a zygote that is diploid. And that grows into something called a sporophyte, which is a diploid structure of a plant. And the sporophyte makes spores, all right? Sporophyte makes spores. That's important to know. Sporophyte changes its diploid self, splits in half, does meiosis, makes spores. All right, haploid spores. Those spores float around in the air and they land on the ground and they make a gametophyte. And we're going to go through this again just because I really want you to understand this, all right? This is how everything works. This is how plants work. Gametophyte is made from a spore. So a spore cell, a single little spore cell is haploid, goes on the ground, makes copies of itself, and generates a big old gametophyte. And the gametophyte has sexual structures on it. Gametophyte is a sexual thing. So it makes eggs, it makes sperm, the sperm swims over to the egg, and they fuse together. These diploids, these haploid cells, haploid sperm, haploid egg, they fuse together into a diploid thing. They have 2 copies of the chromosome, just like your sperm and someone else's egg would combine to make a diploid cell. Everything works that way. That's just how it works, all right? So they combine together inside of a zygote. It's called a zygote when they combine together, a diploid zygote. And then that turns into a sporophyte again. So you're just alternating between sporophytes and gametophytes and going on and on and on and on. So that's the haplodiplontic life cycle. Okay, and we'll look at this in a more detail. This is a generalized view of all plants. Here's an example. This is a moss. Sporophyte is this little thing right here, this stalk. And the gametophyte are these little things. These things produce the eggs and sperm, and they combine together, and that generates into a sporophyte right here. And this thing is full of spores. And the cap pops off, and spores fly everywhere, and they land on the ground, and they make another gametophyte. And that makes eggs and sperm again, and so forth. Bryophytes, mosses. All right, this is the nice tree of life again. We're back here, we're at bryophytes. Read exercise 21, read the introduction, read the first 2 pages about charophytes. Like I told you earlier, read about them. They're pretty neat. Just read about it. And liverworts, read about that too. That's just yet another bryophyte. But we're going to talk about mosses right now. Mosses are little bitty plants. You'll hear about mosses all the time. They grow on the sides of trees. They grow in little dark corners. They grow around on rocks. But the key thing is that they grow in moist environments and they avoid sunlight. So whenever you want to walk outside and find a moss, look in darker places that are moist. Look on trees. They like growing on trees, on the sides of trees, but on the side that's not exposed to sun. That's why there's like this north-south thing. When you're in the forest, you can look at where the moss grows. I forget which part it is, but you'll see that it prefers one side of the tree rather than the other. So 21.4 is where we're at, mostly in the gametophyte stage. Mosses are primarily gametophytes, which means they're haploid all the time. And this is why they avoid the sun, because they're haploid. If their genes mutate from sun rays, they'll die. They only have one copy of their genes. That's important to know. Okay, that's just why. That's why they avoid the sun. So gametophytes, all nice right here, they move on to Antheridia and Archegonia. Those are the two sexual structures we'll look at on slides. So gametophytes, they're different gametophytes. So one gametophyte will make a Archegonia and the other will make an Antheridia. And Antheridia is the male structure. It will make sperm. The sperm will fly out and it will try to land in the right place and hit the egg. And their movement, they have to move in water. That's why it has to be in a moist area. So the sperm moves around, hits the egg, and it fertilizes it. And then the fertilization turns into a diploid cell called a zygote. And the zygote turns into a bunch of tissue that develops into the sporophyte, which is a diploid structure because the zygote is diploid and from the egg and sperm. I know I'm over-explaining this, but I don't care. I want you to understand this. So this is the sporophyte. This is this sporangium. Sporangium is a structure that holds spores, and that releases the spores. And actually, when it dehydrates, it will just pop. When it's ready, it will just explode spores everywhere. Spores will go, carried by the wind, go to another dank, dark, and moist area and turn into a gametophyte. That's how that works. So these spores will germinate into gametophytes. That's the life cycle of a bryophyte. So, yeah. Spores are not seeds. This is why this is a seedless plant. The spores are not seeds. These plants reproduce by spores, not seeds. We'll talk about seeds when we get to seeded plants, okay? Those are the flowers and pine trees and whatnot. So I want you to go find a moss right now. It would be really nice if you can find one, just so that you can get some application. Treat this as a real lab and go outside and find a moss, okay? This is the only time in your academic career you'll actually get to go outside and learn about what you're doing in class. Look at these guys. These are some examples. Look at that. Wow, it's growing on a rock. Wow, these are growing in a nice forest. Go to a forest if you want to. Look at all these little structures that are growing on rocks. On a tree, nice tree moss, some more mosses, moss growing everywhere, more moss, and there you go. So go outside and find something. It would be really cool if you did. Help you understand. You can point out to your friends, oh, that's a moss. Wow, cool. Now, we're on slides. Let's look at our slides. Moss antheridia. Moss antheridia is the male structure of a moss. It makes sperm. That's the whole point, is to make sperm, and then we'll talk about the other part, which makes an egg. So know this, know these three structures, know the paraphyses. That is these little things right here. These little growths, these outstretches right here. Yeah, that's about it. Those are paraphyses. I don't know what they do. I forget. Maybe something to do with sperm. and sperm movement and stuff. But these are the important parts. The sterile jacket and the spur-forming tissue. So these are these things, these dark blue stained areas. These are the sperm structures. These are what make sperm. So the sterile jacket is right here. It's this outer layer right here. This outer layer is the sterile jacket. It's a jacket around the sperm. So yeah, and this right here is the sperm forming tissue. So this will differentiate into sperm cells, all right? And then it's surrounded by the sterile jacket. So that's the moss antheridia. Moss, but there's another example. Here's another slide. Same thing, same exact thing. This is the sperm forming tissue, sterile jacket, paraphyses right over here. Same thing as well, paraphyses, just more examples. Sperm forming tissue, sterile jacket around the air, around the sperm forming tissue. All right, so know that you will be tested on it probably. Moss archegonium. This is a moss archegonium, makes eggs. So moss antheridium, moss archegonium is part of the gametophyte, and it makes an egg. Know what the egg cell is and know what the neck is. Neck. What is the neck? The egg cell is right here. You'll see that right there. This nice little structure right here, it houses the egg. So that's the egg cell. The neck comes from the egg cell. So this is the neck right here. So this is the egg cell, and the part above the egg is this. That is the neck. Yes, the neck. Moss capsule. This is the sporophyte. Sporophyte, this is gametophyte, 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 gametophyte. Sporophyte. This is what makes spores. Moss capsule has spores inside of it. Look at that. These are all the spores. And if you look closer, I'll show you a closer image of what the spore looks like, but these are all the spores. And there's millions of them, and they all fly into the air and they all colonize everything. But mosses are pretty bad at colonizing. So peristomal teeth are these right here. They're kind of right on the cap of it, the tip of the capsule, and that is what opens up to release the spores. So that's the peristome in a better picture, and this is the slide. And there's another one. These are the spores. Individual red dots are all the spores in there. So there's the capsule. Moss protonema. This is a gametophyte. This is the baby little gametophyte that will turn into the antheridium and archegonium to make the structures. This is what the spore makes. So these spores fly out, they land on the ground, a moist area, and they'll branch out into little protonemas. And these things, they're just like little baby gametophytes that the spore makes. That's about it. That's it. This is a protonema. Just know protonema. This is a protonema. That's what a spore makes. And there's a better microscope image. Of course, it's photosynthetic. Needs to absorb sunlight too. All right, that's about it for mosses. All right, let's take a breather. Let's relax a little bit. All right. Ferns. This is the next part of the lab. Are ferns, chapter or exercise 22. So read that as well. Read the introduction, know all that stuff. Look at your handout, know what to read, because it will be on your next practical. So there you go. These are the ferns. Yeah, you just know what fern is. Fern. This is a fern. So this is kind of the progression between plants. So you go from mosses, kind of the lower order of plants, if you like to think that way, and then you go up to ferns, and then you go up to the big boys, the flowering plants and the pine cones and all those things. Those seeded plants is what I mean. seed plants are a pretty big deal. So we're gonna talk about ferns right now. They don't make seeds, they make spores, all right? They make swords, not seed. They make spores, not seeds. So go find a fern. Now we're gonna go outside and find a fern, okay? We're gonna simulate this digitally. Go outside and find a fern yourself. If you're lucky, you'll find one growing on a tree or growing on the ground. This is kind of what they look like, this little fan structure. This is a frond that will make these things. And that's another one. And these are also ferns. Ferns have these little things on the underside of their leaf. They're called sori. And these are the spore forming things, because ferns don't make seeds. They don't make seeds, they make spores. So each little fern, these little soris, all right here, are spore forming things. So these are just another example, and there's more things. These are more ferns growing on trees. You'll find these in a lot of places. So maybe go look at trees and you might find little ferns growing on them. I think they're parasitic, or there's symbionts of the tree. So yeah, this is the underside, a closer look at the sori. Every single fern has this. So this is, if you see these, that is a fern. These little things that grow on the leaves. It's pretty weird. I think it's weird. Look at those, wow. Yeah, look at these, wow, look at that, wow. Soris everywhere. Wow, these are big ones. So go look at ferns. They're really a delight. So great. All right, so with ferns, this is the life cycle. Life cycle of ferns generates between sporophyte to gametophyte, as always. In all plants, you'll generate between haplodipontic life cycle. So you'll have sporophyte and you'll have a gametophyte. It's very confusing. So get used to it and know it. Know it very well. So the sporophyte in the fern's case is this, the thing that you see. These are all sporophytes because these are the spore making structures. Sporophytes make the spores. Yeah, they're everywhere. So this is the main cycle of the fern. They're mainly a sporophyte, diploid, so they can take on sunlight a lot easier. That's a big deal. That's a really big deal. You may not realize it, but it's a big deal that it's a diploid thing. So the sporophyte is more successful, and you will see that in all the other plants we talk about. This is the spore forming structure. So inside of the sporophyte are the spore forming structures, and these are called sori. Soris, sporangiums, are right here. The sori are structures that have sporangia in it. Sporangia are these things that house the spores. So this is kind of zoom in image of a sporangium. When it breaks open, it's kind of like a catapult actually. It curls up, has the spores inside, and when water leaves it, it throws the spores into the air. So ferns are always shooting spores everywhere. And the spores go out and they turn into this thing called a gametophyte. Spores grow into a gametophyte in a nice moist area. It has to be a watery environment because that is how you reproduce as a fern. The spores land, they make a gametophyte. It's kind of shaped like a heart, and they'll have archegonia on it, which make eggs, and they'll have antheridia on it, which makes sperm. Okay. And antheridia will make sperm, archegonia will make eggs. Sperm will go to the egg, fertilize it, and you'll be good. And all the antheridia are kind of located up here, so the sperm flies down, goes to the egg, swims in the water. Actually, they move around. They swim through the water. They try to find an egg, and they meet up, make a zygote, and turn into an embryo called the sporophyte. So this is the gametophyte, and this is where the egg was fertilized, and the sporophyte is growing out of it. And the roots, called the rhizoid, is the root of a fern. It's not a real root, so they call it a rhizoid or a rhizome. And there it is. There's the sporophyte. One thing to mention is that the gametophyte is so small that you'll rarely ever see it. It's microscopic. So you don't see the gametophyte very often. You see the sporophyte all the time. Yeah. Sori. So this is the sori right here. This is an example. So you look on the underside of a fern leaf, you see the sori. This is what it looks like. It has the sporangia in it. So these are all little sporangias, and the annulus part of the sori, the annulus part of the sporangium, I mean. So these are sporangias. This is the annulus right here. It's that little backbone to the sporangia. So this is the backbone of the sporangia. And that is what's responsible. The annulus is responsible for flinging the spores everywhere. This is more examples. So these are the annuluses, annulus, and this is the sporangium of the whole thing. And these are already broken. So these already shot their spores everywhere. If you saw an empty one, or these are more, yeah, these are good. These are full of spores, and they're about to pop and throw the spores everywhere. And the spores turn into gametophyte, as always, and the gametophyte looks like this. It's very beautiful. Looks like a heart. Antheridia are on the sides here. Archegonia are in the middle. This is the slide. If you look closer, the Archegonia have a bunch of eggs in it, and if you look closer, the Antheridia have a bunch of sperms in it. So know that. And next, oh, this is another picture. This is another microscope image. These are the rhizoids that the gametophyte makes, and these are Antheridia. The Archegonia are always here at the little crevice. So the crevice here is where the Archegonia are. So Archegonia are down here, Antheridia are up here. Sperms go down to the egg, fertilize, and it makes a prothallus. So these are where the eggs were, and right at where the egg was fertilized into a zygote, it turns into a plant, turns into a sporophyte, right? Because you know your life cycles and you know that it turns into a sporophyte. This is what it looks like. This is a little baby sporophyte, little baby fern that just wants to go. So know that this is the primary leaf right here. Primary leaf that's going to photosynthesize and do all that stuff. The primary root is more down here, like right here, I think. The rhizoids are right here. This is kind of where the rhizoid is forming. And the Antheridia would be over here. Can't see them right now, but they're over here. And the Archegonia are over here, as always. That's just what it is. So yeah, I think that's it. I think that's all this y'all need to know for today. That was kind of short. Shorter lab, I guess. That is it. You're looking to learn about mosses and ferns and just the general structure of plants and the kind of the life of plants, the whole diversity that they have and their life cycle. So know their life cycle. That's very important. Sporophyte, gametophyte, that whole stuff. You'll probably not understand as much right now, but please study it. Look at diagrams. Look at all the life cycle diagrams and look at them and try to understand. Redraw them and you'll try to memorize. Drawing is really useful for biology. So try to memorize in that case. Flashcards, no. No. Flashcards are bad. Okay? If you want study advice in college, you don't use flashcards very often, especially in biology. You want to look at the book and take notes. Write. Writing things is really, really a good way to study. And I'm sure after your practical, you may have realized that you may have not done as well as you like. So try to learn how to study. Studying is good. Learning how to learn is very important, an essential skill to college. So how do you do it? Well, in biology, I see people, me and all other people, I'm a senior, all other people in all the advanced classes in biology, they write. They write down notes. They rewrite notes. They write notes. They go through the textbook. Textbook has everything you need to know in it, and then some. So in this class, go through your lab manual. Go through the exercise. Look at the introduction. If there's something you don't understand that well, write it down and like write it up. Go through the thought process. Understand conceptually. How does that work? Oh, how does that structured? What does that do? How is that structured? How does this life cycle work? You go through each little step and kind of understand conceptually what it means. Go outside, look at a real thing, and understand what part of the life cycle it is at. So that will help you study. Studying biology is not just memorization. That is not a right thing to think, okay? Don't think that. That's bad. Studying biology is conceptual, meaning that you don't have to tie words to things all the time. You don't have to tie language to what you're learning. You can understand something without knowing what it's called. And that's what I mean by conceptual learning. You can understand what a tree is without knowing that it's a tree. When you're a child, you haven't learned what a tree is and what the word tree is. And you looked at a tree and you're like, oh, that's just that little thing that has a little trunk and leaves coming out. And that's your conceptual understanding of a tree. When you're a child, you know what trees are and you climb them. So you know what to climb all the time. That's conceptual learning. And that's what biology is. That's how you study biology. Really, that's the truth. And I know this isn't just a lab video, I'm just lecturing you on how to study, but I find that a lot of people don't understand how to study, and I want you to be successful in your academic studies and your life as well. So with that, I'm going to leave, and you have a fantastic day and go about your lives and study your ferns and look at your mosses, go outside and look at things. Yeah, yep. That's about it. I'm gonna leave right now.